Just a quick note, recording
Very
is in
important.
progress. A quick note on the format of tonight's event. Dr. Gordon will open things up for us with about 20 minutes of remarks upon his book and tonight's subject of discussion. Following this, Stanford graduate students Courtney Hodrick and Amber Moyles Harper, who are both here on the screen, will offer some comments on the book. And the purpose of these comments will be to spark and offer parameters for our subsequent collective discussion. To keep our conversation orderly, we will ask that those who wish to pose a question or offer a comment or response, quote, raise their hand on Zoom before doing so. You can access the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Eschel and I will keep track of the number of hands raised and the order in which they were raised as best as we can. And when you have finished offering your question or comment, please lower your hand. You may also choose to ask your question in writing by making use of the chat function, also accessible at the bottom of the screen. And I'll read out the questions that appear in chat. So before turning the conversation over to Peter, I would like to introduce tonight's respondents as well as Peter himself. So Amber Moyles Harper is a third-year PhD candidate in art history at Stanford, here at Stanford, and a co-coordinator of The Contemporary. She focuses on the aesthetic changes that took place in early 20th century Europe in the wake of industrialization and with the advent of cinema. Courtney Hodrick is a fourth-year PhD candidate in German studies at Stanford as well. Her research focuses on 20th century German Jewish thinkers, and she is writing her dissertation on the concept of hope in the works of Hannah Arendt. Dr. Peter E. Gordon is the Amabel B. James Professor of History, faculty affiliate in the Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures, and faculty affiliate in the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University. He is a critical theorist and an historian of modern European philosophy and social thought, specializing in Frankfurt School critical theory, phenomenology, existentialism, and Western Marxism. A frequent contributor of criticism and commentary to periodicals such as the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and many others. He has published major works on Heidegger, the Frankfurt School, Jürgen Habermas, and Theodor W. Adorno. Among his major works of scholarship are the books Rosenzweig and Heidegger, Between Judaism and German Philosophy, published in 2003 by the University of California Press, Continental Divide, Heidegger, Cassirer, Davos, published in 2010 by Harvard University Press, and Adorno and Existence, also published by HUP in 2016. We are very pleased and honored to be gathered today to discuss his most recent book, Migrants and the Profane, which many of you here this evening have read in preparation for this event or before. So welcome everyone, and without further ado, I will ask Peter to please go ahead and begin his remarks.
Thank you very much. Is this audio good? Am I at a good volume? Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ben, for the kind introduction. And let me express my sincere thanks to Amir Eschel for his invitation to participate in this conversation, and to the colleagues assembled here who've agreed to share their thoughts. I know that everybody's taxed to the limits these days, far beyond the usual, because our circumstances are indeed unusual. And participating in a book forum over Zoom in the late afternoon and toward the end of the week is not a small commitment. For those who may not have read the book, and I would not want to presume that you had, let me offer just a few brief words on how I came to write it, what my motivations were, and what it is that it tries to say. First, I should note that the theoretical concerns that moved me to write this book are ones that stretch back several years, at least as early as 2007, when I had the pleasure of joining with some colleagues at Harvard to read the rather imposing book by Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. Now, despite my admiration for Taylor, his book troubled me a bit, and I wrote a critical review of it that appeared in the journal The History of Ideas. What I discerned in the book was an echo of a theoretical view, one that punctuates the history of philosophy and social thought, namely, the view that modernity suffers from a potentially fatal deficit of normative resources, for which religion offers the only sufficient remedy. This thesis, which I call the thesis of the normative deficit of modernity, is a commonplace in religious thought, of course, and one might say it's as old as religion itself, since the religious believer will typically regard the unbeliever's world as fallen and will insist that only by hearkening to the voice of God can the world be saved. Variations on that theme belong to the deep structure of modern social theory. Max Weber gave the thesis of a normative deficit its classical sociological formulation when he observed that the disenchantment of the world must end in a crisis of meaning, the famous Sinnproblem in Weber. This was Weber's view. Religiously derived norms of economic and political conduct once sustained us and bound traditional societies into a coherent whole. But these norms, he feared, were now losing their grip, though we might hope that traces of divine inspiration or charisma can be retrieved to give modern society the direction it sorely needs, lest it ossify into a soulless machine. Now, I should clarify that Weber was by no means a nostalgic thinker. In theorizing the normative deficit, he didn't wish us to return fully in what he believed would be an infantile or craven fashion to the resources of religion. But he nonetheless documented this crisis in the modern age as one that attended the Entzauberung der Welt, the disenchantment of the world. His sociology is therefore a rather grim exercise in documenting the rationalization and disenchantment of the world and the various pathologies that have emerged as a consequence of that twofold process. Now, in the century since his death, Weber's theory of secularization has become a theme with many variations. The notion of a normative deficit can be found in theorists such as Carl Schmitt on the right, who condemned liberalism as a law-governed machine that tries to suppress its own need for a system-transcendent grounding in the quasi-divine powers of a decisionistic sovereign. But I would claim that the thesis of a normative deficit has also found a receptive ear even in unlikely quarters, such as in the work of the philosopher Jürgen Habermas, especially in his work of the last 30 years, where we see he's increasingly come to see religion as the privileged, if not unique, source of normativity for a rationalized modernity that otherwise lacks the moral compass it requires, if that is, it hopes to resist the merely functionalist imperatives of a norm-free system. Now, despite my great admiration for Habermas, I've written in a somewhat critical spirit about that turn in his work, since I think it awards too much to religion alone and adopts a skeptical posture about the possibility that the modern world may also possess normative resources of its own, even while I would grant that it might also find instruction in religious traditions. Now, in his most recent work, Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, which will be translated into English eventually as, I believe, This Too, a Philosophy of History. This Too, a History of Philosophy. I'm always reversing those because he's playing on a title by Herder. In his most recent work, Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, Habermas follows what he calls the traces of a learning process, whereby philosophy might borrow from religion insights that it then has transformed and that might ultimately be brought into the volatile sphere of public democratic reasoning. Habermas calls this project a genealogy of post-metaphysical thinking. But it's telling, I think, that he assigns to religion a privileged or even unique role in his narrative as a fund of normativity, without which a secularized modernity, he fears, might spin out of control. Now, while I agree that religion can serve as one normative resource among many, which is to say, it offers various moral and political insights that furnish guidance that we require as we navigate the complex, rationalized life world in which we live. While I agree that religion might serve as one normative resource among many in that sense, it seems to me that we go too far when we grant religion or any one normative resource the prestige of uniqueness. This very same skepticism, by the way, would also call into question dogmatic versions of secularism that seek to exclude religion as a metaphysical error. And for that reason, I've also expressed rather strong criticism of Martin Hagelin's book, This Life. Some of you might know that book. A book in which the dualistic choice between eternity and finitude that he sees in religious tradition, rather controversially I'd add, is not so much abandoned as merely inverted, so that temporal finitude and the constitutive fact of our mortality are supposed to serve, he believes, as the unique point of departure for any humane politics, and he concludes also for socialism. But now let me put all of those references aside. A preoccupation with the question of the normative deficit of modernity has consumed my attention for the last several years, and it was the chief inspiration for Migrants in the Profane. But it's a book, and I'll just make a more autobiographical remark here. It's a book that also marks a definitive end to an early phase of philosophical interest in Heidegger's existential ontology and my turn toward critical theory. After wandering in the Heideggerian wilderness for more than 2 decades, it came as a kind of relief for me to attach myself to a tradition that speaks with such candor to the emancipatory interests of humanity and also sustains its faith in rational standards of argumentation. I was fortunate enough to exchange some thoughts with Jürgen Habermas about my book when he was completing his own manuscript, Auch eine Geschichte der Philosophie, and I'm proud to say that he cites Migrants in the very last footnote of his monumental study. And maybe it's a sign of my esteem for Habermas that I really can't imagine a better secular apotheosis for my own career as a scholar than this modest appearance at the bottom of the last page of his book. So that's boasting. Forgive me. 2 further points deserve mention here. Those of you who've seen the book may not recognize the image on its cover, which is a 1939, it's a 1939 painting with the title, The Wandering Jew, by Felix Nussbaum, the Osnabrück-born artist who was murdered in Auschwitz. Now, it so happens that Nussbaum also painted my own great-grandfather, Elias, who was the cantor in the Osnabrück synagogue on Rolandstrasse that burned to the ground on Kristallnacht. That's inaccurate. It burned hollow. The brickwork remained. When one ponders the idea of a migrant in the profane, the overdetermined history of European Jewry, of course, is never far from one's mind. Well, enough about the cover. If you turn to the first page, you'd see that the book is dedicated to Martin Jay, who was my doctoral advisor and whose work cleared the path for scholarship on critical theory in the Anglophone world. All of this then is just to say that the book is one charged with personal as well as scholarly meaning, and writing it was a true pleasure. Before I come to the contents of the book and its precise arguments, I want to note one final point. I was grateful back in 2017, to receive an invitation from the Yale program in Judaic Studies to deliver their Franz Rosenzweig lectures in modern Jewish thought. And this book is a revised and expanded version of those lectures, and it may help to explain why I felt it was appropriate to foreground certain questions of Jewish history and philosophy, particularly in the introduction. The result, I still fear, is 2 books welded together into one, and some readers may notice that the seam that joins the Jewish questions and questions of social theory is imperfect at best. Okay, now to summarize the actual substance of the argument very briefly. The task I gave myself in this book was to reconstruct a well-known problem in first-generation critical theory. The 3 main chapters of the book address Benjamin, Horkheimer, and Adorno in that order. And my guiding claim is that all 3 of them devoted some attention to the question as to how religion might persist in secular form. In a curious remark about his late friend Walter Benjamin, Adorno wrote that theological concepts can only survive in the modern world if they undergo a difficult trial of secularization. They can persist, he said, only if they submit to what he calls an Einwanderung ins Profane, or a migration into the profane. Now, variations on that phrase appear, it's rather surprising, with some frequency in Adorno's work. For instance, when he writes toward the end of Negative Dialectics that today, he says, metaphysics migrates into micrology, which is to say, metaphysics now seeks in the practice of secular criticism what he calls refuge from the totality. That's a complex idea that I won't go into at the moment. Now, one might have thought that that secularization proviso, that theological concepts can only survive if they undergo a migration into the profane, that secularization proviso would be a desideratum for all critical theory. But in my comparative treatment of the three authors, my conclusion is that Benjamin did not sustain a commitment to secularization with any consistency. He remained trapped in a posture of ambivalence, looking to theological concepts to fill what he believed to be a gap in historical materialism. Insofar as Benjamin saw himself as an historical materialist, which is perhaps controversial, his thinking was caught in an unworkable bind. Any coherent version of historical materialism must see the changes of history as emerging only from the immanent contradictions of history itself. Benjamin, I argue, violates this principle by assigning the power of revolution to a messianic and transcendent force that bursts in upon history as if from the outside. And in this sense, Benjamin endorses the theory of a normative deficit. Now, in a rather different way, the same ambivalence about secularization is evident in Max Horkheimer's work. Especially toward the end of his life, Horkheimer, too, abandoned the idea of critical theory as a practice of thoroughly immanent critique that draws upon purely this-worldly resources. And he appealed to the transcendent powers of religion as the only possible resources for this worldly despair, the only possible remedy for this worldly despair. Of the trio examined in the book, then, only Adorno, I argue, managed to avoid this posture of self-sabotaging skepticism. But he did so, I claim, without endorsing a crude dualism where only secular concepts have value. His negative dialectic is not religious, but it might be understood as the secularized fulfillment of a negative theology, one that pursues the theological practice of negation without restraint until it touches upon even theology itself. In his work, secularization is a dynamic and genuinely dialectical gesture that moves from the theological to the secular. To pursue this claim, I entertain a rather provocative comparison between Adorno's negative dialectic and the philosophy of Maimonides, whose own thinking places its stress on negation as the route to redemptive understanding. Adorno's critique of ideology might be seen as inheriting the medieval critique of idolatry, except that Adorno uses his own negative critique to dissolve even the divine idea that negative theology was meant to preserve. As a final point, I want to suggest that Adorno's call for a migration into the profane might hold special significance today, when we're faced with a migration crisis and unprecedented challenges of cultural and religious heterogeneity. These challenges, I think, require that we reconsider dogmatic forms of secularist political organization that risk merely excluding our religious co-citizens, even while we also need to uphold the requirement that religious claims submit themselves to the authority of mundane reason. Without belaboring the point, the book concludes by offering some speculative comments as to why the fact of modern ethno-religious pluralism requires that all of us undergo a kind of disenchantment of identity. The demand that we uproot ourselves and the insight that humanity is not fixed but wandering is hardly new, I claim. And it can be found in biblical narratives and even appears in Augustine's City of God, where humanity appears on a path of the peregrina in seculo, migration through the secular world. Secularization, then, is a demand that perhaps begins in religion itself. And perhaps we might be most faithful to that original demand, that original commandment, as we embark on the necessary, if difficult, task of a migration into the profane. That's my best effort at offering a brief summary of the book, and I look forward to hearing comments. Thank you.
So Ben, who goes next? Amber?
It's Amber. Amber's next.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. I'll just say thank you so much, Professor Gordon, for joining us here at the Contemporary, and thank you, Ben, for introducing us, and Amir for being such a wonderful mentor during my time at Stanford, being driver behind the Contemporary the last decade. I am going to make a few comments on some points from Professor Gordon's book that I found to be particularly interesting and provocative, and then Courtney will follow up with a couple more points that we hope will open up the conversation to everyone who's joined us tonight. Revisiting the first section of Professor Gordon's book on Walter Benjamin brings forth the following questions for me. Where can we locate the sacred within the profane, and how and to what end has the sacred entered the profane? Professor Gordon approaches these questions from a number of different angles, which lay the foundation for the remainder of the book, the chapters that turn around Max Horkheimer and Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno. One of these is to address the role that theology has played in interpretations of history. Professor Gordon does this by directing our attention to the allegory of the chess-playing automaton, with which Benjamin begins his theses on philosophy of history. For those unfamiliar with the theses or who have not yet read Professor Gordon's book, the automaton, which appears to be able to move itself through the use of mechanical principles, is in fact powered by a human being who has been hidden within the mechanical frame of a pipe-smoking gentleman from Turkey. The kernel of this aphorism is that the machine, which appears to be a secular miracle, in fact relies on the power of the human figure, which in a Judeo-Christian narrative has itself been created by God. For Benjamin, this human being becomes a kind of ghost in the machine, or the figure of theology, which he says is small and must be kept out of sight in the secular world. For the automaton and for the broader meaning of Benjamin's aphorism, however, it is the energies of theology that are necessary and necessarily instrumentalized, so that the image of enlightenment rationality embodied in the automaton can appear victorious. How does this relate to the role theology plays in interpretations of history? The answer lies in the important fact that the figure of theology is hidden within the secular. A narrative of progress in which life on earth will get increasingly better is merely a secularized version of the Christian supersession in which Christianity usurped Judaism and the new Eden will usurp this world at the end of time. Looking forward to Professor Gordon's chapter on Horkheimer, we can also see that the accrual of wealth and or political power, which acted as a sign of divine favor in Protestantism, has a similar function in the secular world, albeit the religious meaning is now hidden. What was divine favor becomes the validation of one's works, whatever their character. Let us move on to the second question posed: how and to what end has the sacred entered the profane? It is important to note at this point that Benjamin does not speak against the hidden theological figure, but merely wonders how these hidden energies can be adapted for actualizing a revolution, another kind of supersession when there is a need for it. The Christian worldview, however faulty, is nevertheless one in which radical transformation is possible. Things can get better, fortunes can change, and one can be saved. It makes sense, however, that Benjamin would hope to secure the energies of a Jewish worldview for his own philosophy rather than a Christian one, because it is in the Jewish tradition that the Messiah has not yet arrived, and the possibility that history can be ruptured is pending, or rather fills every moment with revolutionary messianic potential. I want to briefly comment further on the second question: how and to what end has the sacred entered the profane? It is important that Professor Gordon's chapter on Benjamin addresses this from the perspective of aesthetics, through Benjamin's concept of the aura. Prior to the modern period, human beings had encountered works of art within the social context of religion, whether that be the communal space of a cathedral or in cultic practice. These were auratic works of art, which Benjamin linked to an earlier pre-industrial historical period, whereas the modern era is cast as that in which the aura has come into decline, invoking an essentially different mode of perception, which is predicated on the experience of shock, the overstimulation of the senses. The de-eroticized work of art is, by contrast, one received in distraction, one that lacks the perceptual investment of the viewer, the counterpart of de-eroticized perception. But it is interesting to note that meaningful experiences which approach the spiritual before artworks that are supposed to now exist entirely within the profane, still happen. To a certain extent, and within the context of Professor Gordon's book, the de-eroticized artwork can be seen as the equivalent of the aniconic sermon, or the aniconic apophatic conception of God. Of the sacred, sorry. The de-eroticized work of art, after all, overwhelms the senses and denies the reification of meaningful experience by enlisting the principle of shock. I was particularly interested in the etymological similarities between the term ablenken, meaning to distract, and ungelenk, roughly meaning without direction. For in Moses and Aaron, Arnold Schoenberg has Moses protest against his role as a prophet by saying, is ungelenk. It is, however, Moses, precisely because of being ungelenk and not gifted as an orator, that he's able to have faith in an aniconic deity. It is in any case worth considering art as one place in which the sacred creeps into or remains hidden within the profane. And with that, I want to pass the mic on to my friend and colleague, Courtney Hodrick. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Amber. And thank you for those incredible remarks. Picking up where you left off and sort of moving roughly through the book in order. I have a number of questions and observations that I hope we'll be able to dig into in the more conversational portion of this event that will follow. And the first of those concerns the status of religion as such, and in particular, in the dialectic of enlightenment, which, Professor Gordon, in your book seems to be a story of human reason and its fall. And the moment through which reason passes through what I would call the religious stage seems to be something really fascinating, because on the one hand, there's this constant interplay at all times dialectically between myth and reason, and instrumental rationality is present in the mythic stage, in animistic religion, as we move through into monotheism and then into secular enlightenment. And so it seems that there are a number of different stories that you could tell and a number of different roles that religion could play in this, right? In one version of the story, there's an increasing move towards nominalization, an increasing abstraction, such that monotheism is more abstract than polytheism. And this seems to be almost like the Jaspers axial age argument to which you refer briefly. In that version, I would say religion might be almost a Goldilocks moment where you have enough of a sense of the individual that you have a sense of human dignity, but not yet so much sense of the individual that nature becomes mere object. It's not too disenchanted. but I'm wondering whether there's something unique about monotheism as such, whether it's something more than simply one of the stages that are passed through, and whether there's a way to reconcile the sort of contrast that you point to in earlier and later Horkheimer, wherein the earlier Horkheimer seems to see religion as one stage among many in the process, but then later in his life really turns to religion as the only thing that could ground, the holy other. And so this question of the apotheosis of the individual, the extent to which myth and rationality are themselves present in religion, or whether theology and monotheistic theology in particular are something unique in human history, is one that I think is really raised interestingly by the book. My next question then gets a little more specific in the question of which religion, and I think Amber has already spoken in a really lovely way of the messianic hope that has not yet been fulfilled. And thinking about the normative deficit of modernity, it seems, I apologize, I'm once again going to divide things into twos. I like dichotomies. Maybe I'll dialectically resolve them, but it seems that there are two different versions of a normative deficit. There's almost the positive and the negative. So in the positive, theology became a font for ideas like human dignity, like progress, like morality as such. This is even as early as, Dostoevsky, if there is no immortality of the soul, then everything is permitted, right? This idea of the law-giving, positive theology. But then there's also the normative deficit to which I see all three of these Frankfurt School thinkers referring, which seems to almost be a negative normative deficit, which is the loss of religion as space outside, as the transcendent ground from which we can then perform critique. And I wonder whether you see in that sense these two forms of the normative deficit as corresponding to the loss of respectively Christian and Jewish religion in society, and whether you see in that sense the critique practiced by the Frankfurt School and the pursuit of the space outside as specifically a secularized form of Jewish thinking, which it seems to me based then on the comparison between Adorno and Maimonides that you do. But I would hope to hear more about the specifically Jewish theological element of that normative deficit. And then finally, I was really fascinated and moved by the conclusion, and in particular by the idea that transcendental homelessness is, in a sense, the normative ethical stance that we should all adopt within modernity. And something that I've personally been reflecting on over the past few weeks and given recent events, and I apologize for bringing politics into this, but they're lurking in the book, is the question of whether the phrase "next year in Jerusalem" is meant to be a metaphor, and whether it's meant to stand in for a messianic hope, or whether it literally means next year in literal physical Jerusalem. And I think that question is more pressing than ever. And my concern with the secular turn is that if we are to practice an ethic of transcendental homelessness, and if we are to see ourselves as migrants in the profane, my concern, and perhaps my own normative deficit, is the idea that we must be migrants from somewhere, and there must be a somewhere to which we are migrating. And I worry about the tenability and sustainability of a sense of transcendental homelessness without a transcendent, and a sense of homelessness that does not conceive of itself as having an end, a sort of permanent existential exile. And perhaps that puts me then in line with Martin Hegland and seeing really the secularism and the transcendence as two poles from which we must choose one. And so I'm open to being convinced and talked into this exile from nowhere. But I'm interested to see what it would look like, and perhaps even on an effective level, what it would feel like, and whether Adorno in particular is a figure who was able to get there and who we could use as a model, and what it would look like really to not dwell and to not be at home in our homes and to be migrants, with the sense that that would never come to an end and that the exile would never come to an end, and to be at home in that sense in the profane rather than migrating through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney and Amber. That was wonderful. I'm going to give Peter the opportunity, just because those questions might be fresh in his mind, to respond. But while he's doing so, please, if you have questions or comments, raise your hand with the hand raising function below, or you can type a question into chat. Thank you.
Amber and Courtney, thank you both very much. Those are extraordinarily rich comments. I have to say, I've done a number of these Zoom events this spring around my book, and I have to say these might be some of the most challenging and discerning comments I've heard. They're extraordinary, and I can't do them justice within a few minutes here. But let me offer just a few responses that I hope will at least be a gesture of honoring all the insight that you just brought to bear on the book. It's very, very helpful. One of the nice things about having readers of books is that you find out what it is that you actually meant to say, or that you should have thought harder about. And that's always a humbling experience. And that's, of course, the life of the mind and the life of the scholar, that we realize that. Sometimes one realizes this with chagrin, with a sense of esprit d'escalier, right? You know, that after the fact, when you could have said something better before you published it. But it's inevitable, of course, that one doesn't anticipate everything. And these are very, very discerning thoughts. So, this is not just an honoring gesture. I mean it quite seriously. These are very rich comments. Let me take up some of the themes in turn. Amber, you concentrated in your remarks on the aesthetic and on Benjamin's notion of the decay of the aura, and the possibility of a de-auraticized mode of art that would be consumed in a state of distraction. What I've always found very interesting about that idea is how strongly it contrasts with Adorno. And those of you who know Adorno's aesthetic theory, his posthumously published book, know that from almost beginning to end, he's in dialogue with and offering rejoinders to Benjamin's ghost. I mean, Benjamin really haunts that book. And Adorno never ceased to argue with Benjamin precisely about this idea of the possibility of wholly de-auraticized art. Adorno says somewhere near the beginning of the aesthetic theory that art is the secularization of revelation, or maybe it's the secularization of transcendence. Forgive me, I don't remember which is the term at the moment. And it's an interesting remark, and it captures, I think, what you were saying, Amber, about how art might remain one of the places of the sacred, even in the profane. I think that's a very Adornian thought. Adorno thought it was not a very Benjaminian thought, and Adorno may have misunderstood Benjamin on this point, but I think it was Benjamin's claim, particularly in his essay on the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproducibility, that traditional art takes shape in a matrix of ritual, first magical, then religious, but and that even bourgeois art, say in the 19th, 20th, and early 20th century, still persists in some kind of theological understanding, which is to say that the artwork does seem to be the place of the sacred in the profane. It's my understanding that Benjamin, however, wanted to, in a way, disenchant art, that the aura could be stripped away, and that there might be a way of experiencing a work of art that would be set free from the constraints, the inhibitions of the sacred. That the bourgeois idea of a negative theology of art, as he calls it, could be dispensed with. And that only when the aura had been fully stripped away, only when there was a fully disenchanted art, could art then have the potential to serve revolutionary purposes. So my understanding of Benjamin's argument then is that he's actually at that point apparently embracing wholesale a doctrine of secularization. Now, Amber, I wholly agree with you, however, that Benjamin is also very ambivalent about notions of progress. And certainly we see that at the end of his life in his essay on the concept of history. And one might ask whether one can celebrate the disenchantment of the work of art and at the same time contest a notion of progress. I say that because, at its limit, the notion of progress would be the idea that once things were bad and now they're better, or that there was a condition that was unwanted and we have somehow liberated ourselves from that condition. I mean, conceptually, the notion of progress can be spun out in various ways, and there are rich notions of progress that one might want to contest because we associate them, say, with modernization theory, and therefore you have people, brilliant theorists like Amy Allen, who in her book The End of Progress wants to decolonize critical theory, which is to say she wants to detach critical theory from any robust notions of progress. But I've quarreled with Amy Allen a little bit in this book on precisely this point, because I think that progress just conceptually means that there's a state of affairs that was unwanted, and we at least orient ourselves toward a state of affairs that would leave that earlier condition behind. And I would like to say that it's part of the very logic of emancipatory social action that one adheres to that minimalist or perhaps purely regulative ideal of progress. So I don't think critical theory can do without it. There may be more robust notions of progress that are contaminated with imperialist condescension for tradition, and perhaps we want to do without those. But that's not the same as dispensing with the concept of progress altogether. Nonetheless, as with that aside, I do think it's entirely right that Benjamin himself, at the end of his life, somehow thought that the proper understanding of historical materialism would be one that endorses rupture, not progress. It's not social democracy. It's not Bernsteinian revisionism. Socialism would not emerge through a slow, uninterrupted growth of the better world. Instead, the better world would emerge, as it were, all at once by breaking out of the continuum of history. So in that sense, it looks as if Benjamin is against progress. And that just heightens my sense that Benjamin is not a consistent thinker. And I think that's fine. I mean, I don't think he wanted to be a consistent thinker. I think he's better at experimentation than social theoretical argumentation. He's someone who changed his mind and leapt from one interesting insight to another interesting insight, and that's his great advantage. But it does mean that what comes to a certain point where, for example, you can't decide, is he in favor of something like secularization or is he against it? So I could say much more on that, but Amber, thank you for your comments. Courtney, your comments are equally rich, and I also will not be able to do justice to them. But I'll try to speak to the three main points that you raised. The first has to do with the status of religion in dialectic of enlightenment. One of the things I try to say in the book is that in dialectic of enlightenment, religion actually doesn't appear with much frequency. It appears as it's apparently only as a kind of way station. You call it the Goldilocks moment, and I like that idea. As a kind of momentary passage from myth to enlightenment. And here it's clear that they have in mind some stylized conception of abstract ethical monotheism. Whether it's Jewish or Christian, I'm not entirely certain, but it seems to me more a kind of stripped down version of monotheism that is a philosophical construct for them. What I think is interesting is in the brief passage where it's mentioned, I argue that it's Janus-faced. In other words, that they see both its advantages and its disadvantages. On the one hand, monotheism can appear to promise the cleansing of myth from the world and the disappearance of a certain kind of mythic immanence, which also holds us captive in an irrational manner. On the other hand, monotheism is the very ur-model for the beginning of a world transcendent subjectivity. And in that sense, it's the primal figure of a world dominating subject which emerges in full force at the end of modernity and is what they want to indict as the transcendent force of instrumental reason. So I want to say that monotheism, therefore, is Janus-faced. It faces two ways. It's both a promise and a harbinger of the Enlightenment's dialectic. Enlightenment always means two things in the book, as we know. It always means both the promise and the betrayal of that promise. This is the dialectic for them. It means that those two simultaneously. And they think that simultaneity of the Enlightenment and its betrayal is locked into the meaning of Enlightenment, apparently since its very inception, so that they would claim the moment humanity descended from the trees and began to form concepts, we began to destroy the difference, the plenitude of the world, and subsume the difference under similarity, subjecting nature to the world-dominating force of reason and its demand for fungibility, prefiguring, even at the very beginning of concepts, the capitalist realm of exchange, where everything is fungible, everything can be exchanged for everything else. So in dialectic of enlightenment, I think so too, just like the word enlightenment has that double meaning, so too religion has that double meaning. As to the second question, you asked which religion, and I really like the idea that Amber presented and that you endorsed, that it's important for them that the messianic hope hasn't yet arrived. And that would seem to indicate that the kind of religion that they are talking about is one that is always future oriented. It can't imagine a kind of past incarnation that will then that then prefigures a divine return. So I can imagine then you might say it's more Judaism than Christianity. I really like your distinction between two different versions of the normative deficit, and I need to think more about that. The first would be look to theology as a resource or preserve of norms of progress, dignity, law, and so forth. The second would describe our deficit as in losing religion as the loss of a space that is outside. And that's a very, very good distinction. I hadn't thought to parse it that way. And I think it's very clear that for both Adorno and Horkheimer, one of the potential advantages of religion is that it offers a perspective on the world as if from some remove. Adorno famously develops that point in the Zum Ende to Minima Moralia, for example. But he acknowledges that it's perhaps impossible. It's necessary, but impossible. And Horkheimer himself came to thought that its necessity perhaps outstripped its impossibility, which is why at the end of his life, this notion of the wholly other became for him so profoundly important. He thought that critique is only possible if we truly do sustain this notion of something that is other than the world, something that is outside the given, outside conditions as they are given. So I think that that's a very helpful distinction. And I don't know what it means for the first idea, for religion as a source of norms of progress, dignity, law, and so forth. Adorno's quite clear and quite skeptical about attempts to simply map religious norms onto the modern world. In his essay on reason and revelation, he makes this point in a quite brutal fashion. He says people who somehow believe that in the modern age we can just appeal to religious tradition and borrow all of its moral insights and apply them in our world are missing a basic feature of the modern world, which is things are just enormously different and complex. We don't live within sacred communities. The notion of a face-to-face Gemeinschaft has disappeared entirely, and religious morality, therefore, simply won't map on to the modern world in the way we might like. So he's very reluctant to endorse that idea of looking to religion as an actual source of normativity, but he holds on to that idea of religion as a primal figure of negation, of a critical break. And that's what I see ultimately as his proximity to Maimonides, where the practice of negative theology involves prosecuting positive terms in order to achieve some higher understanding. For Adorno, too, the practice of negative dialectics, which negates the given, negates ideology, not idolatry, but ideology, perhaps the modern secularized version of idolatry, is also a way of our gaining the critical insight we require if we're ever going to break out of the open air prison of a rationalized modernity. Now, I'll come to your third point, the conclusion and transcendental homelessness. It's a very discerning remark, and I was aware of the fact that this metaphor of a migration into the profane itself raises the stakes here, because it seems to imply not just a departure but an arrival. And it's interesting that Adorno often uses the phrase Einwanderung, not Auswanderung, which is to say migration into, not just departure, but arrival. And I'm aware of that. And it therefore calls for some explanation. It seems to me that in so much of his writing about existential ontology, about Heidegger, and about the broader cultural phenomenon that he called the jargon of authenticity. He was ruthless about any notion of authentic dwelling, any notion of authentic arrival, any notion of finally achieving a kind of self-identity, a stage of complete reconciliation where we have finally come to rest within ourselves, and there is no longer any remaining negativity. He's quite critical of that. It's one of the I would say it's one of his most consistent polemics from the very beginning, from his inaugural address in Frankfurt all the way to the end of his life. Now, I hold on to that in the conclusion, and therefore insist on this idea that perhaps the figure of the migrant is one we need to embrace. I realize there's something quite precarious in doing that, and I want to end my comments by saying that I find it deeply uncomfortable to turn any condition of human suffering into a philosopheme, into an abstract figure that can be mobilized for philosophical argument, or that we can somehow cherish. We should not cherish human suffering. It should not recommend itself to us as a permanent condition, and as therefore somehow constitutive of something we value in being human. And I'm deeply aware of that, and therefore troubled even by my own gestures in the conclusion, where it may seem that I've done that. And nonetheless, I in the most straightforward sense, it seems to me that the fact of ethno-religious pluralism in the world today is one that cannot be reversed. And that means erecting frameworks of political governments and informal frameworks of identification that are not just porous, but relativized, where we understand that our own commitments may not be those of our fellow citizens, and we need to erect frameworks of justice that are as inclusive and as porous as possible. And if that means abandoning notions of ethno-religious or ethno-national homogeneity, I think that's an absolute necessity. That does, of course, have political consequences. And indeed, in the news in most recent weeks, I have found confirmation of my own perspective on that. Well, that was insufficient, but I want to thank you both for very rich comments.
Thank you, Peter, Courtney, and Amber. So we have at the moment 2 questions. We have the first one from Stephanie Graff. It's in the chat, so I'm going to read it. And then after Stephanie, we have a raised hand from Altair. So hang on, Altair, while we read Stephanie's question. So I'm reading the whole thing. And Amir has his hand up. Okay. Thank you for this concise presentation. I totally admire your intervention into the current secularization debate and the necessary clarification against Adorno's supposed nihilism. However, I would be somewhat hesitant to accept that Benjamin endorses the theory of normative deficit of modernity. Adorno himself assumed his own procedure of, quote, inverse theology as indebted with Benjamin, especially with the view presented in the origin of the German Trauerspiel. On several occasions, Benjamin criticizes what he calls processes of despicable secularization, setting his own view of a radical secularization against it. Couldn't it be that Benjamin's messianism is an already profane one, only attending a terminology that remains more faithful to his early influences, for example, Gershom Scholem?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. I have to say, I always regret this webinar format because Stephanie is somewhere out there. Hello. And I regret not seeing everybody who's so that they can feel that they fully participate insofar as Zoom allows. Stephanie, it's a very, very good question. What I mean when I say that Benjamin endorses a theory of the normative deficit of modernity is just that is a very simple and rather rather modest point that that some of his images of the secular world suggest that the secular world is lacking in something that it requires. I think that that's evident in the Trauerspiel book, which depends so much upon a Lutheran theology and the presentation of a stage in which the characters cannot affect actual change. They live amongst ruins. The prince is weak and indecisive. The necessary resources for actually redeeming human life seem not to be there. Now there's a kind of dialectical twist at the very end of the book where our radical fallenness becomes kind of a preparation for an ultimate redemption, and that's a very interesting twist. It's a very Lutheran twist, by the way, and Benjamin is tempted by it at the end of the book. But the general portrait that he gives of the world, of at least of the Baroque world, there is a world that is wholly fallen, that is in need of grace but lacks that grace. Now that comes back, I would say, as a kind of in a kind of Marxist guise in his late essay on the concept of history, where historical materialism appears in two forms. First, there's the degraded social democratic or revisionist form, which is basically lifeless once again. It's mere technology. It's the truly necessary change will never emerge, right? And Benjamin contrasts that with what he believes to be the authentic form of historical materialism, one which somehow draws upon the resources of theology. And the historical materialist, he says, therefore, is endowed with a weak messianic power. Now, it's that thought that I think betrays this notion that the purely non-theological practice of historical materialism is not sufficient. Something needs to be injected into it. We borrow it. He calls it a weak messianic power. And in that respect, because we need to borrow something and inject it into historical materialism to make it work, that's the thought that I'm calling a deficit. He thinks that the purely secular is insufficient. Now, Stephanie, you're right to, I think, press me on this point and say, look, maybe he's only attending a terminology, one that remains faithful to his early influences. And I think that is a very good rejoinder to me. I think a very good rejoinder to me would be that I'm taking Benjamin's religious language too seriously. If that's the case, then so be it. Then maybe I don't have an argument to make here about Benjamin. I'm not convinced about that because there are so many places through his corpus where he seems to endorse theology in some sense. There's the famous image of the ink and the ink pad, the ink and the blotting paper, for example, where he says, you know, my thinking relates to theology as the blotting paper to the ink, and which is to say, my thinking is saturated with it, with religion, and that's a curious remark for someone to make if he means it only metaphorically. There's much more I could say about that, particularly this notion of inverse theology. I've written about that elsewhere, but thank you. It's a very helpful comment, and it's a good corrective.
Altair, I'm gonna click the button that I think will allow you to ask your question.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And I was just struck, I just wanted to bring up a perhaps obvious parallel or perhaps obvious point in terms of the sacred in the profane. And having recently read Yuri Slezkin's book, The House of Government, on the kind of first 2 decades of the Soviet regime in Russia in the 20s and 30s, and his kind of large-scale explanation for how we understand the Soviet Union in that period is that it was a messianic regime, that it was trying to find a kind of secular religious cause through which to understand both Russia and the world more broadly, and that, you know, quite apart from the writings of Marx and Engels, the way that communism took shape in Russia, you know, from 1917 onwards, can only be understood as a sort of messianic cause. That's the only way that we can understand both the subsequent civil war, the way that the subsequent show trials took place, the way that people voluntarily confessed and so forth, that it all took place within the structures of what we might term to be religious institutions, even though it was actually, you know, entirely a secular government that is in fact felt incredibly threatened by the Orthodox Church and did all it could to suppress it. So it's not so much a question for you, but just to raise this point of where the sacred and the profane kind of intertwine and reinforce one another in the 20th century at the very moment when these writers, Adorno, Benjamin, and so forth, are also working, albeit usually in a different part of Europe at that time. So I just wanted to raise that comparison to buttress what you've been talking about today. So thank you.
Thank you. Altair it is, yes. Thank you. Those are very interesting comments. I mean, you know, the thought that Marxism is in some sense a messianic movement or a crypto religious movement is an old one. You know, it was given a classical formulation, for example, by Karl Löwit, who saw in any discourses of meaning in history, including Marxist and Hegelian, attempts to sustain inherited religious notions of eschatology, of progress, of historical meaning. And it became a major feature of Cold War polemic, of course, against Soviet communism, which ironically seemed openly to disavow religion or to endorse militant atheism, but was somehow crypto-religious nonetheless. I think Slezkin's argument is an interesting one. It's of course a more sociological understanding of the sacred that I'm pursuing in my book, and I think we do need to distinguish between the theological and the sacred. Theology is an archive of concepts. Religion is a social form. The sacred, you might say, is a galvanizing force, one that creates social cohesion. It's a very Durkheimian notion. When Durkheim speaks about the sacred, he's thinking about the force of social solidarity. What is it that allows societies to cohere? And Slezkin's argument, it seems to me, is neo-Durkheimian in exactly this sense, because what he's really saying is that the Soviet Union exhibited in all of its rituals of social cohesion the same notion of the sacred community, of sacred ritual, of belonging, of the homogeneity of the group, notions that are no different than those of ancient religious communities. This is why Durkheim, of course, said there's no religion that is false. And this is why Durkheim thought that modern nationalism is a form of religion. And so too, you might say Marxism in that sense is a neo-Durkheimian religion. But this has more to do with the sociological understanding of the sacred as what permits social solidarity. Are there analogs in Soviet history to religious ritual? Yeah, no doubt. Are there analogs to robust religious belief? There, I might disagree. But Yuri Slezkin, of course, knows vastly more about this than I do. But the little I know through anecdote, through visiting the Soviet Union when it was still the Soviet Union, through my understanding of the history of dissident communities, is that many people didn't believe at all. They developed a posture of extraordinary cynicism about the ideology that was being enforced, sometimes brutally, around them, and that explains some of the brilliantly dark humor that became so commonplace in the Soviet Union. I mean, Soviet jokes are full of that. I mean, they didn't believe. They didn't believe, and I mean, maybe some of the high officials did believe, and maybe in the early years there was a kind of a messianic fervor of belief. But you know, in the 60s and the 70s, did the people living under Brezhnev believe in Marxist-Leninism in the same way that adherents of religious communities believe in their teachings? I rather doubt that. But this may be a point that Slezkin actually addresses in his books, and I'm sure I'm doing an injustice to him. But that's just some simple thoughts on this.
Thank you, Altair and Peter. So Altair, I'm going to send you back to the netherworld of the attendees. Sorry about that. We have a question from Alan in the chat. How would you say the idea of normative deficit is affected by recent historical works which contest the concept of an eclipse of religion in modernity? I'm thinking of works such as The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences by Jason Josephson, Storm, but also other studies on the occult enlightenment, Martinism, theosophy, etc.
Well, you have me at a disadvantage. I don't know Storm's book, and that sounds very interesting, The Myth of Disenchantment. I mean, I'm aware, of course, that the notion that there has ever been anything like secularization is hotly contested. Many people have turned against secularization theory with a vengeance. It's a term that's rather out of favor among sociologists, and sometimes for good reason. I mean, secularization became a kind of a dogma, and it was ripe for overturning, as indeed all scholarly dogmas are. I'm less concerned with the broader sociological question as to whether secularization happened or not than I am in this book with the very specific philosophical gesture of secularization and what work it did for Benjamin Horkheimer and Adorno. So that's a very timid or evasive response. But I can offer a more robust response, if you like, about sociological theory. Secularization can mean many different things. And Jose Casanova, the sociologist, has done wonderful work in his book, Public Religion in the Modern World, to differentiate its many meanings. One thing it can mean is simply the decline in reported religious belief and the decline in various practices that would seem to confirm that belief, for example, church attendance. By almost any measure in the world today, belief is in decline, and religious practices in decline. That's certainly the case in the industrialized, in the global North. It is nonetheless the case, of course, that various forms of Christianity and Islam are still catching fire and expanding in the global South, particularly, for example, in Africa, where Christianity is growing. What one does with those kinds of differentiations is up for debate, and sociologists debate it a great deal. What it would seem to mean is that a kind of grand narrative of world secularization is simply too broad a generalization to have much purchase. One needs to differentiate. What regions of the world are you talking about? What kind of religion are you talking about? Do you accept that, for example, modern countercultural modes of spirituality count as religion? Because if so, you might say reported traditionalist belief declines as,
astrology, for
sure.
example.
Sure. As what some of the German sociologists disparagingly call, forgive me, California syncretism, increases, right? So one needs to differentiate here, and that's only the notion of reported religious belief and attendant practices. But then there's, for example, the other meaning of secularization, which came from the church itself, which is the breaking apart, the prizing apart of governmental structures and religious structures. And that's something that, like I said, goes way back to the early history of Catholicism, which differentiated between sacred priests and secular priests. Secular priests or secular clergy are the ones who circulate in the world, whereas the monks remain cloistered. And that's the original difference out of which we get our idea of secularization. And then, of course, it took a more dramatic form in the 17th and in the 18th century with the legal and economic prizing away of church territory, which was called the secularization of Catholic lands and Catholic properties. And that, of course, could sometimes take violent forms, for example, with the French Revolution, where a great deal of church property was secularized in that sense. But in modern political theory, of course, we use the word secularization in that second sense to describe the way in which modern forms of government are detached from any theological referent or theological modes of legitimation. And most liberal democracies in the West have pretty much accepted that. The United States lags behind lamentably and contests it all the time. But if you look at Western Europe, I mean, they've pretty much accepted that idea. Though, of course, the notion of some kind of religious identity still lurks within ostensibly secular cultures in Western Europe. And that brings me to the final point I'll mention here, which is that the secularization model or secularism has come under criticism by a variety of sociologists and anthropologists, people like Saba Mahmood and Talal Asad and others, because they claim that secularism is an ideology that usually is accompanied by a kind of crypto-Christian and crypto-Protestant understandings of society, so that even when we are trying to enforce secular principles that are meant to include all people, they produce paradoxical inequalities and exclusions. To my mind, I think their criticism is right, but they draw the wrong conclusion. Their criticism and their observation is entirely correct, but that doesn't mean that the principle of secularism needs to be abandoned. That simply means it hasn't been accurate. It actually hasn't been true to its concept. It hasn't been faithfully applied. I would say that when it's not being faithfully applied, that means not that the principle is incoherent, but that it's not actually as secularist as it claims to be. That's no mark against the principle. That's a mark against human beings. But enough said about that.
So we have coming up now, we have Amir who has a question, and then Henry Stern who has dropped a question in the Q&A tab, and then Eva in the chat. Just as we approach the 1.5 hour mark, if you have questions, you should get them in now, because I know it's late for the East Coast folks, and people joining from elsewhere too. So Amir, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Ben. And I should mention also that Ben says in the chat that Quebec Society is a very good example for what you just said, Peter. So, so there you go. Peter, I was struck, toward the end of your remarks or responses to the question, you began to draw kind of a vision of where we may be going, where we should be going, given just the fact of migration, global migration trends, etc. And I was struck as to your opinion, to what extent the vocabulary offered by the three thinkers you're focusing on in this book offers us, the vocabulary to create that future political system, global political system. And let me, sharpen this question by suggesting that perhaps the very notion of negativity, is too narrow in order to envision anything, we may be moving toward. And my question to you, as someone who's studying, Frankfurt School in this tradition, in such a deep and wonderful manner, and especially as I know, admiring Adorno so much, how could we then kind of take this vocabulary, take this tradition and bring it to 2021 in order to really cope with some of the challenges, that we're all facing, not just in this country, but really around the globe?
Yeah, it's a great question and a very small one. It's a lovely question, and I wish I had more to offer. I mean, I think that the three thinkers addressed in this book are critical theorists who are more exploratory than prescriptive, and that is their limitation. Benjamin was remarkably imaginative and experimental. Horkheimer could be fiercely skeptical, but was a superb historian of philosophy. Adorno, practicing his inimitable method of negative criticism, very rarely offers glimpses of what he thinks the world would be like if it were the way the world should be. There are a few remarks here and there. Once he speaks about a world of difference without domination, for example, and I quote that at the end of the book, because I think difference without domination is a fairly good abstract picture of the world we need to envision, particularly under conditions of extraordinary ethno-religious, ethno-national, ethno-racial heterogeneity. And we need to embrace that heterogeneity as much as we can. We need to create forms of governance that permit difference without domination. Adorno was not, however, a terrific political theorist. He really wasn't. He didn't think much about institutions. He offers some remarks on sociology, but typically it's sociology of music. He came out of music and aesthetics, and his initial thoughts on sociology were sociology of music. And he wasn't a terrific political theorist. The political theorists among the Frankfurters were others like Otto Kirchheimer and Neumann and others, figures who sometimes aren't seen as quite as sexy as Benjamin Adorno and Horkheimer. And that there are there are others who work on critical theory who would offer deeper thoughts on what the world could be like. But I do think that Habermas has devoted so much of his career to trying to fill out what he believed to be the lack of a normative foundation in critical theory. I disagree with him, by the way, that Horkheimer and Adorno didn't have that. But nonetheless, he tried to work out an understanding of public reason, of intersubjective reason that could serve as a normative resource for a social theory. And his social theory is indeed robust, very sophisticated, very well developed, and he's turned his attention a great deal to the challenge of pluralism, as indeed did his American interlocutor, John Rawls. So I should probably just refer to my betters and say that the tradition of critical theory continues. Habermas has many superb students who have tried to work out those kinds of thoughts. People like Rachel Yegi, Axel Honneth, and others. And those are the people I think one has to turn to have a more differentiated and thicker description of modern society so that we can understand what we should do today. And those are the people that I read to understand that.
Thank you. So Henry has a simple question of words and meaning. Wanderer versus migrant. Why one and not the other? Wanderers and migrants figure heavily in Jewish theology and practice. How do these figures relate to the choice between wanderer and migrant in your work? And what does that choice say about your philosophy of modernity?
What a great question. I had never thought of that. It's a lovely distinction, and you're right. I don't thematize that. And you might say that Adorno's own language of Einwanderung or Auswanderung, when he uses that, might have been translated as wandering. Although Einwanderung is, it is wandering with a direction. I mean, the difference between wandering and migration is that wandering goes all over the place. It doesn't follow one particular path. It isn't unidirectional, or it doesn't even have any particular directionality. And you might say that migration always has a directionality to it. People are going from somewhere to somewhere. Just wandering, I mean, maybe you get you get something like the Heideggerian Holzweg. We're wandering a forest path without believing that we'll go anywhere. And as a matter of fact, that really comes through in the French translation of Heidegger's Holzweg, Chemin qui vient nulle part, which is the French version of the title. Paths that don't go anywhere. I mean, the French may have taken it a little bit too literally, or too figuratively. I don't know, but that's a lovely version of Heidegger's title. And I want to say that it's not that we're just going nulle part. There is some directionality to human life. There's a purposiveness and direction. There's something we're trying to achieve. And even if we're always on that path, even if we are always migrants, and if I want to say that migration is somehow constitutive of the human condition, it somehow retains the notion of there being a common project and a common direction. And therefore, once again, a sense of emancipatory purpose or even progress that we're aiming at. And that's something that I don't think critical theory can ever truly abandon. Its notion of an emancipatory purpose and direction in human history is one that is deeply scored into critical theory.
Amir, did you want to say something?
Just to say, what a fantastic way to conclude a conversation. Peter, I mean, I could not have wished, better words.
We do have one question that's been sitting there for 10 minutes. If you don't mind venturing like a quick answer. This is from Eva, and it's, is there a sphere of the secular that exists without an analogous structure or being intertwined with the theological?
It's a wonderful question. Well, it's a very, very good question, because our notion of the secular comes from religion, right? As I mentioned before, even historically, and our notion of what the saeculum is. I mean, originally it meant a particular era, the saeculum, but it quickly took up spatial meanings within Catholicism itself. So our notion of the secular, as contrasted with the theological or religious, is something that first emerges within the religious imagination. Can one nonetheless imagine a version of the secular that is entirely detached from the theological? It's a good question. Imagining that would be imagining that we embrace something like the secular without an implicit contrast to something we're doing without, something we've left behind, something we have expelled. And logically that becomes a bit difficult, because our notion of the secular, I would say, is just conceptually, it's contrastive. When you say the secular, you mean something that's not religious. And this is something that I expressed to Martin Haglund, whose book, by the way, I think is truly fascinating, and it stimulated a lot of thoughts for me. I think he's a brilliant person. And it's a fascinating book. But one of my quarrels with his book was that I thought that his attempt to endow human finitude, human secular life, this life, with so much meaning relies necessarily upon the contrast, what it rejects. And the result is, I think, a rather dualistic notion, that we embrace this life because we don't embrace eternity. And Hagelin presents that as if this is what it would mean to eventually abandon religion. I don't think that's abandoning religion. I think it's still inhabiting the religious definitions. What it would look like to fully inhabit our finitude without relying upon the polemical contrast to theology or eternity is a very, very interesting question. I think that Adorno tried to get at that with something like his notion of animal life, of his mimetic relationship to the world, our embodied creaturely selfhood, the happiness or pleasure that we have merely as embodied creatures. But it's difficult to develop that idea if we hold on to the idea of the secular, because that notion relies so much on the term it rejects. And although I'm not a deconstructive thinker, I do think we need to notice here how the term that we exclude is still haunting the one that we endorse. So the secular seems to be haunted by the religious.
Wonderful. Peter, you were very gracious and forthcoming with your time. Your presentation was absolutely wonderful. The conversation just the same. I thank you really from the bottom of my heart for a wonderful evening together. I thank Amber and Courtney for great comments and questions. I thank Ben for being such a wonderful host and moderator. I thank all of you who were here together with us in the room, although we didn't see your faces, you were with us in spirit. Thanks again to all of you, and hopefully, Peter, we can welcome you back to Stanford now that things seem to be becoming more normal. So as I said in the beginning, you have an open invitation to come back and enlighten us with your wonderful work in person, be present with us.
Well, thank you, Amir. I must say that having gone to graduate school in the Bay Area, I always feel like I'm living in Galut when I'm elsewhere than the Bay Area. And I would love to come back to the Holy Land, which is indeed where you are now. So I'm quite jealous. And thank you very much for the talk. Amber and Courtney, your questions were terrific. And thank you, Amir and Ben, for organizing all this, and for the other people who asked questions. It was delightful.
Great, wonderful. And once again, I'll just mention briefly that this event is co-sponsored and co-hosted by the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, the group on the contemporary, and the Division for Cultures, Languages, and Literatures, or the other way around. I never get it straightforward. So good evening, good night, and hopefully we'll see you in a future event of the contemporary soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much.
Thanks.
I didn't want to interrupt